Okay, you should see a screen in front of you that says government price controls. Another type we're talking about is price floors. So that's the topic of discussion now. Now, what are the intentions of a price floor? In particular, price floors are a minimum price that you can charge for something. You can't go lower than this when you set a price floor. And really, the best example of this is minimum wages for workers. So here, we're shifting our attention from what we describe or call everything we've done so far has been a product market, like a good or a service, like butter or milk or coffee that's being supplied to consumers in the marketplace. But now we're going to turn our attention to a different aspect of markets, which is the labor market. The labor market is the market for workers on the supply side, the production side of the marketplace. And here too, we can describe a labor market much like we describe a product market. There are suppliers of labor. Those are going to be the workers who wish to find jobs. And there's going to be demanders of labor. That's going to be the firms who are looking to hire workers to work in their particular establishment or business. All right. Now, the market should determine an equilibrium wage that's going to be paid to your average worker. And that's what is often raised up with a minimum wage law. That's the implementation of a price floor. Now, why do that? Well, one reason is higher wages, or wages today at the minimum are often viewed and suggested are not enough to live on. If you work full time at a minimum wage job, you're not going to be able to support yourself or your family, pay your rent, pay your monthly bills that are expected and normal, even for a low-income household, and it's just going to be difficult to do that. So if we could raise the wages of workers higher, we might be able to ensure that they get something that's closer to what has often been described, or the term is used, living wage. And a living wage is defined as those necessary to support a household. So one intention of minimum wages is try to get the wages of all lower income individuals to be much higher so that they can support their families and live decently. Okay, another thing that it's likely to achieve, perhaps, is reducing inequality. The rich are making lots of money, the poor seem to be stagnating to a certain degree, and one way to reduce that inequality across incomes is to raise up the lowest incomes, bring them closer, at least a little bit, to give them a better chance. Okay, so that's another intention of putting a price floor in this particular case. And then last, I'm going to talk a little bit about how minimum wages are like unionization. And note that trade unions, working on behalf of a particular worker group, that what they do is they act to bargain for higher wages for all of their company's employees. And that can actually enable them to get the benefits of higher wages, of course. But it's only going to be, if a union is incorporated into a particular company, it's only going to be for that company that faces the higher wages. A minimum wage law, in a sense, is like creating unionization for everybody across the country by raising up the minimum wage that every business has to pay. And in that sense, it's a substitute for unionization on a broader scale. All right, let's talk a little bit about minimum wages, where they are today. So the current federal minimum wage has been stuck since 2009 at the rate of $7.25 per hour. There was talk during the Obama administration over here to raise it to $10.10 nationally, but it never passed. They have not been able in the last 10 years, 11 years, to actually get a change in the federal minimum wage law. Okay, but that's not the end of the story, because states also implement minimum wages at their own state level. And in fact, most states now have minimum wages on their books that are higher than the federal minimum wage. And so the federal minimum wage is effectively defunct. It doesn't matter to those states because the states are raising their minimum wages to other levels. Now, this link here, if you go into the PowerPoint and click on that particular recent state level actions, it'll take you to minimum wages for all of the states in the United States. And if you're interested, you can take a look at that, some of the comparisons there. But here's just a few of them. And note that Maryland is scheduled to increase their minimum wage to $15 by 2026. California up to $12 last year. Illinois, $15 by 2025. New York, $15 minimum wage by 2021, next year. And DC is up this year to a $15 minimum wage, as are other cities like Seattle, I think San Francisco, perhaps Portland out in Oregon. This has become the new sort of call for public policy to increase minimum wages, and especially the key element now is sort of to get it to $15 per hour for individual workers. And note that that's a pretty considerable increase, especially to any state that is currently bound by the federal minimum wage, which is only $7.25. $15 is a substantial increase relative to that. But of course, a $15 national minimum wage isn't going to affect many of these individual municipalities or states because they've already increased their minimum wages locally. Okay, some city level actions also. Here's a couple of cities that have adjusted their minimum wages accordingly and have raised them quite substantially to much higher levels. And then I want to highlight also here that a lot of individual companies have actually raised up their own personal minimums to higher levels. Amazon and Target are now paying their workers at the minimum $15 per hour, as is Costco. Walmart is up to $18 per hour in some localities or jurisdictions. I don't know if that's across the board for Walmart. Starbucks only $9.09. That might be old. They might have increased it more recently. And Bank of America, which is more likely to hire skilled workers rather than unskilled workers, have argued that they're raising their minimum for their employees up to $20 per hour. Okay, again, Bank of America is a different labor market, though, a little bit than your Walmarts and your Starbucks and your Targets, for example. All right, but anyway, this is to put into perspective that there has been this big push to try to increase minimum wages in the United States for a long time. And actually, with the new administration coming in, I believe they have been much more certainly amenable to the notion of pushing for a higher minimum wage at the federal level to kind of keep up with the actions of the states. All right, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the effects of a minimum wage in a labor market, and we're going to think about, well, what happens when you do that? What are the pros? What are the cons? And there are both. When in a perfectly competitive labor market, you raise up the minimum wage. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that analysis. So on the right, you see a labor market. Now notice, when we plot the labor market here, we're going to put the quantity of labor on the horizontal axis, and we're going to measure that labor in hours of work. That's how labor would get measured. How many hours do you devote to work? 40 hours a week, for example, and then you add that up across all of the workers in your particular market to see how much total hours of work is being applied to the production process. The price of labor is the same as the wage rate. So on the vertical axis, the price is in dollars per hour, and it's denoted as the wage rate being paid to workers. Now, it's important to recognize that there's lots of different types of workers out there with different skill levels, different trainings, different expertises, and so forth. And that quite properly, we should think of different workers having different markets associated with them. So the market for plumbers might be different from the market for bakers, which might be different from the market for, insurance salesmen, and so forth and so on, because each of these have got different skill levels and are basically different sets of employees that firms are looking to hire. When we talk about minimum wages, though, we're generally talking about what might be viewed as the unskilled labor market. So this is the workers who are new to work. They may have just entered the labor force. Maybe they have not acquired a college degree, for example. And so, the best employment opportunity available is going to be often working at a minimum wage job at a retail establishment, at a fast food restaurant, and so forth. Or even at a manufacturing firm or at a construction firm, where you don't need to have specialized skills in order to do certain tasks, and you will be hired at what would often be minimum wages in that particular market. So we're kind of talking about that unskilled labor market here. Now, remember this bullet point. We talk about supply in the labor market. We're talking about workers supplying their effort, their labor, to the market. So workers are the suppliers, while firms in this market are the demanders. They're the consumers of labor in this particular market. So everything gets turned upside down relative to what we were doing before. All right, producer surplus now, when we measure it, is going to be associated with worker well-being, and consumer surplus, as we measure it, is going to be associated with the firm or business well-being. Okay, so again, everything is upside down, flipped around, because we're in the input side of the market rather than the output side of the market. Now, we could and probably should have done a better evaluation of where does the demand come from and where does the supply come from on the input side. And there are economic models that look at those decisions much more formally. We're not going to do that. We're just going to keep our simple producer and consumer surplus measures intact, and we're going to interpret them in terms of the well-being that accrues to workers, producer surplus, and the well-being that accrues to consumers or firms in this particular market. Okay, let's go forward. Now, WE, first of all, is the equilibrium free market outcome. So if we left the market be free, then we'd imagine that the labor market would adjust a wage to the wage W sub E, the equilibrium wage, and the equilibrium quantity of hours supplied and demanded would be Q sub E. Okay, so this is the free market outcome in this particular labor market. If a minimum wage is implemented, it doesn't make sense to have the minimum wage down here, because that would just mean that firms would naturally price their wage at a much higher wage anyway. And in fact, that may well be what's going on today. It could be that the $7.25 that's the current federal minimum wage is actually below the unskilled labor market equilibrium. And that could be a reason why independently companies like Walmart and Starbucks and Target are all raising up their minimum wages to employees, because they realize too that the minimum wage at $7.25 is lower than the equilibrium. They're happy just free to raise their wages, and that would be the wages they pay to their workers. So that might possibly be where we're at. And maybe this minimum wage, this market wage today in the United States is, I'm making up a number here, but maybe it's more like $11 or $12 an hour really. Okay, but what if we set the minimum wage higher than the equilibrium? And maybe that minimum wage is that $15 minimum wage that we're talking about. Okay, and that could be much higher than the market wage today. Okay, let's think about what would happen if we raise up the minimum to a much higher level, and we'll see how firms and workers respond to that particular increase in wage. Okay, the first thing that's going to happen is if the wage is set up here, it means that the supply of workers is going to rise up from Q sub E up to Q sub 1. And this supply of workers, remember, this is supply, so this is the workers. They're going to want to work more because they get paid more, right? So you'd expect that if you could get $11 now, but suddenly the government has mandated a $15 minimum wage, well, that's likely to bring more people into the workforce. Younger people will start working when they didn't feel like they had to before. But now they can get a better compensation, and so they're going to be encouraged to increase their supply of jobs or work for the labor market. Okay, however, the increased minimum wage demand is downward sloping, and again, this is the firms now. Because of the higher minimum wage, the quantity demanded by firms is actually going to be reduced to Q sub 0, right? And that means firms are just not going to hire or be willing to hire as many people at a wage of $15 than they might have at a wage of $11 per hour, for example. All right, and that's going to create this problem. Q1 minus Q0 is going to be corresponding to what's listed up here, unemployment. So there's going to be an excess supply of labor in the labor market, and that's going to mean that there's a bunch of workers out there who want to work, but they go out looking for a job, and there's not enough jobs available for them to be hired. So they keep looking, and they're unemployed during that entire period of time. So this is where we end up where the market does not clear. The supply of labor is greater than the demand for labor. And what happens is that the demand is what functionally happens. Because these many people here, up to Q0, they're supplying a job and they're getting a job. All of these remaining people are willing to work, but there are no jobs available for them to work. So they just are out there wishing to work, but not able to work. And that's what's causing this unemployment in the marketplace. And that becomes one of the first problems associated with minimum wages that economists worry about, is that quite likely, perhaps, increasing the minimum wage, especially substantially, is going to actually cause unemployment to the unskilled workers who you're trying to help. Okay, let's go through and see how to evaluate the effects of this. Welfare effects of a minimum wage. Okay, the first thing is let's look at the change in consumer surplus, which is the well-being, again, that's accruing to firms. Now, consumer surplus originally at the pre-market equilibrium wage is given by this area here. Demand curve down to the price and so forth. So it's ABC. What happens afterwards? Well, afterwards, the consumers, the firms, have to pay this higher wage, WM, and their cut back, their demand is down to Q sub 0. So that means the new consumer surplus is going to be area A only. All right, and that means we're going to lose area B and C to the firm. So that's going to be the firms are going to lose out because their costs are increasing and they're cutting back their demand for labor in the labor market. Okay, so consumer surplus, firm welfare goes down by area B plus C. Okay, what about workers? Producer surplus. Here it's a little bit trickier. Producer surplus is given originally by this area here. Okay, it's area D, E, and F, the area between the price in the market, WE, and the supply curve in the market, and the vertical axis. Okay, but as a supplier of labor, what happens when the minimum wage is put into place is that your wage doesn't fall down to W sub L. Instead, the wage of the minimum wage worker goes up to WM. Now, for these people out to Q0, these are the employed workers. These workers are actually getting a wage, WM, but their willingness to supply the product is down here. So their new surplus is going to be given by B, D, and F. Remember, it was D, E, and F before. Now it's B, D, and F. As a result, so this is because, hey, the workers that are still working are actually happy about this, of course, because they're getting that higher minimum wage. And that, in fact, is the intention of this policy, right? To take the workers who are working at unskilled jobs and to give them more money. And that's exactly what's going to happen to these individuals who continue to be employed. That's going to give them extra surplus area B, and that's added on to the total surplus that was available before. But they're losing area E. And this corresponds to the workers who are unemployed, who lose their jobs because of the higher wages that the firms now have to make. Remember, firms are going to respond to the prices they have to pay for their inputs, and they're going to adjust their usage of those inputs accordingly. So if the wage is mandated to be higher, the firms don't just sit by and say, okay, well, we'll just hire everybody like we did before, and we'll go about our business. They don't. Instead, they respond to the higher wage by cutting back their demand for it. Okay, and so fewer workers work. And these workers who lose their jobs lose surplus area given by area E. That's why the change in producer surplus here is plus B minus E. Okay, you're going to add the B because the workers are getting higher wages, but you're going to lose E because some workers are now unemployed, have lost their jobs because of the higher minimum wage. All right, so let's add up the effects. We add these two effects together and notice we have a minus B carried into the parentheses here, a minus B and a plus B, so those cancel out. We're left still with a minus C and a minus E, so that's going to be the total effect of the minimum wage law in this particular market. It's actually going to create deadweight losses, and those deadweight losses are the net effect after we've taken account of all the positives and we've counted all the negatives and we add them all up together. We end up creating a loss in overall economic happiness or well-being given by area C and E. Now notice that those are, we would call them deadweight losses. So there's a loss of economic efficiency as a result of the minimum wage. And that means overall happiness is reduced. So from an economics perspective, looking at a perfectly competitive labor market like this, the minimum wage law, while helping some, is going to hurt others more. And the losses to the losers are going to exceed the benefits that accrue to the winners, leading to a less good outcome overall for the economy overall. So part of the process here, part of the argument one should make or should think about is, does it make sense to try to benefit some workers when you're hurting a bunch of other workers in the meantime? I also want to point out something here, that when the firms make a decision of cutting back their demand for labor, when they say, hey, if we have to pay higher wages, we're going to have to use fewer workers, they're going to be thinking about their workers not as individuals who all have exactly the same productivity and are all alike. Instead, they're going to recognize that they've got a whole range of workers at the minimum wage. Some are really effective, they come to work on time, they do what they're told, they accomplish their goals, and then they've got a bunch of other workers who don't have those same labor market skills perhaps. They don't show up on time, they don't do the things that they've been asked to do quickly. They work very, very slowly. These are individuals who are the most likely to be laid off now, because the firm is going to simply say, well, I'm not getting much from this worker. I'm willing to train them and maybe give them the skills that they need, but I'm not going to be able to afford to train them at $15 an hour. So they're the ones who are going to lose their job over here between QE and Q0. All right, so it's going to be the worst off minimum wage unskilled workers who are going to be losing out because the minimum wage is being put into place. While those minimum wage workers who might only be minimum wage workers temporarily because maybe they're in high school or college and they've just gotten a job, they work hard, they're going to get promoted to better positions soon. They're going to be the ones who maintain their minimum wage jobs. So the better off people in this class of individuals are going to be the ones who benefit from the minimum wage, while the worse off individuals in the group are going to be the ones who lose. That's what our evaluation of the market tells us. Now, let me just highlight here, what this page is showing is the different types of workers we have. We've got workers now, once you put the minimum wage into place, between 0 and Q0 number of hours. And this is hours of work, but let's just think of this as numbers of workers. Okay, so here we have a bunch of workers between 0 and Q0. They're the best off. They're the ones who really benefit from this minimum wage law because they continue to be employed and they get the higher wage. Then we've got these workers here between Q0 and QE. Those workers are the ones who had a job without the minimum wage law, paying lower wages, but now that the minimum wage law has been put into effect, they're out of a job. So those are the workers who lose their jobs because the minimum wage is increased or put into effect. And then lastly, we've got these individuals here. These are what we might call, they would have been discouraged workers who drop out of the labor market, but now it's the opposite. They're encouraged workers. These are workers who come into the market because the wage is now higher. They'd like to get a job. They weren't participating in the market before, but now they're there willing to work but can't find a job. All right, and then we've got those two different types. Those who lose their jobs are this group, and those who come into the market and don't get jobs is this group. And both of those contribute to what is now measured unemployment that we would have in this particular market.